If you grew up in Canada in the 1960s, you lived in a country your grandkids would barely recognize. A place where front doors stayed unlocked, kids disappeared after breakfast and didn't come home until the streetlights flickered on. And one paycheck was enough to buy a modest house on a quiet street lined with maple trees. It was a decade when Canada was still shaking off the last shadows of empire, finding its own voice, its own symbols, its own rhythm. Life wasn't perfect. Far from it. But if you close your eyes and listen, you can still hear the clack of wooden hockey sticks on asphalt, the jingle of the milkman's bottles at dawn, and the low murmur of hockey night in Canada drifting from every living room on the block. Before we step fully back into that world, tell me this in the comments. What's the very first smell, sound, or memory that comes to your mind when you think of 1960s Canada or the way your parents or grandparents described it? I'd love to read your stories below. And if you want to keep traveling back into the Canada that raised a generation, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our journeys through time. Picture a cool spring morning in 1963. The sun is only just starting to burn the frost off the lawns, and a thin mist hangs over a quiet suburban street somewhere in Ontario. The houses are small by today's standards, modest bungalows or narrow two-story homes with tiny porches and perfectly swept steps. The fences between them don't tower overhead. They barely reach your chest. They aren't there to keep people out. They're just enough to mark where one yard ends and the next begins, so neighbors know where to lean when they stop to talk. You know everyone on this street. Not just their last names, not just what car they drive, but how they take their tea, which kid is shy, whose dad works nights at the factory, and who bakes the best butter tarts. If Mrs. O'Reilly's kitchen light is off later than usual, someone will mention it at the corner store. If Mr. Singh's car isn't in the driveway by 6, a neighbor will crane their neck out the window, just to make sure he's all right. Inside one of those houses, a woman in a housecoat ties back her hair, glances out the small kitchen window, and spots the neighbor hanging laundry. She doesn't pick up a phone. She doesn't send a text. She opens the back door, steps onto the wooden stoop, and calls across the cold morning air, asking if she can borrow a cup of sugar. By the afternoon, the sugar is returned, this time in the form of still warm squares or a plate of cookies, wrapped in wax paper. No one keeps track of who owes who. The balance is invisible but understood. That's just how streets worked. If someone on this block fell ill, there was no online meal train, no group chat to coordinate. Pots of stew and casseroles would simply start appearing like clockwork. A knock at the door, a few quiet words, and a covered dish would change hands. Snowstorms worked the same way. If you stepped outside after a heavy snowfall, you'd see not just one person shoveling their driveway, but almost the whole street, a line of bundled-up figures moving through the white. If an older neighbor struggled, a second or third shovel would silently join in until the path was clear. For children, this tight-knit world meant freedom. After breakfast, cornflakes poured from a cardboard box, milk glugged from a glass bottle. Parents would shrug kids into jackets, hand them a hat if it was cold enough, and send them outside with the same simple rule across most of the country: be home when the streetlights come on. No map, no check-in calls, no GPS. Just a mental picture of which streets were safe, which yards belonged to friends, and which corner store might sell penny candy if you dug enough coins from your pocket. The day would stretch out ahead like an endless road. Kids would wander from yard to yard, casually collecting a gang as they went. Someone would bring out a battered orange ball, someone else a stick with electrical tape wrapped around the blade, and before long, a full game of road hockey would erupt right in the middle of the street. Every Canadian kid knew the choreography, the sudden cry of "car" that sent everyone scrambling to the sidewalk, sticks and nets dragged to the curb until the vehicle passed, a quick wave at the driver, and then back into position as if the interruption had never happened. In winter, the cold didn't cancel childhood, it defined it. The same kids would trudge, half running, half sliding, toward the steepest hill in town, arms wrapped around wooden toboggans or metal runner sleds. They'd spend hours there, trudging up, flying down, wiping out, laughing, resorting themselves into new groups and configurations. Mittens soaked, noses running, breath coming out in clouds, they pushed the limits of their courage one run at a time. No one wore helmets. No one signed waivers. Parents knew there would be bruises, maybe a sprain, certainly a tear or two, but they understood those small risks as part of growing up. The adults' days followed a pattern as predictable as the kids' freedom was wild. In most families, one person left the house in the morning carrying a metal lunchbox or a brown paper bag. Maybe it was a factory worker boarding a bus in Hamilton, a bank clerk straightening his tie in downtown Toronto, a teacher locking their bicycle outside an elementary school in Winnipeg. That one income, in many cases, was enough. A modest house, a car, or the hope of a vacation at a rented cottage for a week in July. These weren't luxuries reserved for the wealthy. They were expectations for anyone willing to work steadily and live within their means. Canada itself was going through something similar. After the devastation and austerity of the war years and ration books, the country was stepping into a kind of cautious prosperity. There was a feeling, not always spoken but always present, that tomorrow would be better than today. It showed up in the way people talked about saving for a home, for their kids' education, for a color television that would replace the black and white sets glowing faintly in living rooms across the country. That optimism wasn't just economic. It was wrapped up in the country's emerging identity. At the start of the decade, you could still see the Union Jack fluttering in places that mattered. Textbooks, official documents, ceremonies, all of them carried echoes of Britain. But under the surface, something was shifting. Quietly at first, then loudly enough that families sitting around their kitchen tables would find themselves arguing about it over meatloaf and mashed potatoes. In February of 1965, that simmering debate crystallized into a single, bold symbol. On a cold day in Ottawa, crowds gathered on Parliament Hill to watch a new flag rise into the winter sky. Red on either side, white in the middle, and a simple maple leaf at its heart. Some people watching that moment felt a lump in their throat. Others felt a twist of discomfort, as if something familiar had been taken away. But whether they cheered or grumbled, most Canadians sensed that this was more than a change of fabric. It was the country quietly saying, we're not just somebody's dominion anymore. We're ourselves. Even if you were a child then, too young to follow the politics, you felt that change in small ways. You saw the new flag pinned to classroom bulletin boards and stitched onto jackets. You heard adults debating in hushed, serious tones while CBC News crackled from the television or radio in the evening. You'd walk into a school assembly and see the old symbols gone, replaced by this clean, bright leaf that seemed, somehow, more like the trees on your own street than anything you'd seen before. That same feeling of stepping into something new would crest again just 2 years later, as the country prepared to celebrate its 100th birthday. Centennial projects popped up everywhere: new pools, parks, libraries, and arenas funded in part by Ottawa but claimed with pride by each town. Kids practiced songs and skits for local parades. Families circled dates on calendars for something big they'd only heard whispered about, a world exposition in Montreal that promised to bring the planet, quite literally, to Canada's doorstep. For many Canadians, especially those in small towns or rural areas, the idea that the world might come to them felt almost unreal. Up to that point, the world was something glimpsed in black and white newsreels before a movie at the local cinema or on a flickering TV broadcast from far away. Now, suddenly, friends and relatives were talking about saving up to travel to Montreal, to walk among futuristic pavilions, to see countries they'd only read about represented in a single place. It seemed like proof that the quiet, polite country they loved was finally stepping into the spotlight, ready to be seen. In living rooms and around dinner tables, these big national moments blended seamlessly into the small routines of daily life: the clink of cutlery, the whir of a washing machine, the thunk of a newspaper landing on the front step. For the families who lived it, 1960s Canada wasn't an abstract decade in a textbook. It was the warm hum of a refrigerator inherited from post-war prosperity, the scent of wet wool drying on a radiator after a snowstorm, the sight of that new red and white flag fluttering against a pale winter sky while kids played in the yard below, utterly unaware that they were growing up in a country quietly reinventing itself right beneath their feet. The country that children ran through so freely in the 1960s was also being stitched together by something quieter but just as transformative, a growing sense of fairness, of shared responsibility. It appeared not only in national symbols and centennial celebrations but in the systems that shaped everyday life. One of the clearest examples lived inside hospitals and doctors' offices. Before the decade began, the fear of medical bills lingered in the back of every family's mind. A bout of pneumonia, a broken leg, an unexpected surgery, any one of those could tip a household from stability into crisis. Parents whispered about neighbors who'd sold their cars or taken on second jobs to pay for operations. Even families who seemed comfortable never forgot that illness carried a cost measured in dollars as well as worry. But as the decade unfolded, something shifted. Saskatchewan took the lead first, experimenting with a radical idea that healthcare shouldn't depend on the thickness of your wallet. That if a child fell ill, if a father collapsed at work, if a mother needed surgery, families shouldn't fear losing their home. The idea spread slowly at first, then with a momentum no one could ignore. By the time the Medical Care Act passed in 1966, the shape of the Canadian future was clear. In kitchens from Victoria to St. John's, people talked about it with a mixture of hope and disbelief. They weren't used to the idea of a government stepping in to lift such a heavy burden from their shoulders. But within a few years, Canadians began to feel the change in the simplest, most human ways. A trip to the doctor didn't mean rearranging the budget. A hospital stay didn't mean financial ruin. Healthcare became not just a service but a signpost of who Canadians believed themselves to be. And beneath all these changes, work remained the rhythm that anchored life. If you walked through a Canadian town early on a weekday morning, you would hear the low hum of industry long before the sun was fully up. Factories with tall brick chimneys churned out everything from automobiles to appliances. Construction crews hammered away at new subdivisions on the edges of cities. Rail yards buzzed with movement as freight trains linked provinces across distances so vast they almost defied imagination. Office towers rose higher each year, casting longer shadows over downtown streets that smelled of cigarette smoke, wet pavement, and fresh newsprint drifting from corner vendors. A single income often supported a family, but the work behind that income could be grueling. Steel workers in Hamilton spent hours inside blistering heat, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. Fishermen along the Atlantic coast hauled their catch in cold, biting winds that seeped through their clothing. Prairie farmers faced seasons that swung from brutal winters to blistering summers, each demanding its own kind of endurance. Even in quieter jobs, bank clerks, secretaries, telephone operators, there was a formality, a pressure to show up polished and reliable every single day. You dressed with intention. A pressed shirt, polished shoes, hair neatly combed. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was expected. Yet despite the hard work, there was real space for life. People ate dinner together around real tables without rushing. Parents spent evenings on porches instead of in traffic. Weekends weren't a frantic attempt to catch up on everything left undone during the week. They were reserved for family drives, community events, or simple rest. You'd see fathers mowing their lawns in long, methodical rows. Children riding bicycles in loops up and down the street. Mothers chatting with neighbors under the shade of maple trees, pushing strollers along sidewalks smooth from decades of footsteps. Life was structured, predictable, and for many, deeply comforting. Inside Canadian homes, another quiet revolution was unfolding. The living room, often simply called the front room, became the heart of the household. Most families owned a television by the mid-60s, a bulky wood-framed set that flickered with programs broadcast by the CBC. Families gathered as if around a communal fire, watching the nightly news, hockey games, or programs made specifically for Canadian audiences. Hockey night in Canada was the closest thing the country had to a weekly ritual. Long before the opening theme music played, you could sense the anticipation building across entire neighborhoods. Fathers would settle into their favorite chairs, snacks laid out on a tray table. Kids sprawled on the floor, arguing about which player was the best. Mothers drifted in and out, carrying bowls of chips or refilling glasses of ginger ale, but always pausing for a few minutes to watch. There was something magical about those evenings. Streets grew quiet. Houses glowed softly from within. And somewhere in the distance, you could hear a cheer erupt as someone's team scored, a sound quickly echoed by other homes nearby. It was as if the whole country leaned forward at the same moment, exhaling together. Even if you weren't a hockey fan, you felt the pull of those communal nights. Music carried its own form of magic. Radios were always playing something, folk songs drifting from kitchen windows, rock and roll pouring from teenagers' bedrooms, crooners filling the air in basements where people gathered for small parties. Many of Canada's soon-to-be icons were just coming into their own. You could hear Gordon Lightfoot's warm, reflective voice on local stations. Leonard Cohen's early songs whispered to a generation grappling with its identity. The guests who could be heard on jukeboxes in diners where teenagers met after school, sharing milkshakes and laughter in Formica booths. And in small clubs scattered across cities, a young Joni Mitchell sang with a clarity that would someday echo around the world. These were the years when Canadian culture, shy, understated, often overshadowed, began finding its footing. People didn't necessarily talk about it at the time. They were too busy living it. But in retrospect, it's clear that something new was taking shape, a quiet confidence that Canadian stories, Canadian artists, Canadian voices deserved to be heard. Community didn't end at the front porch or the living room. It extended through the streets, into schools, into the ways children were raised. Education in the 1960s had a very different texture than it does today. Schools were smaller, class sizes more intimate, and teachers held a kind of authority that was both respected and rarely questioned. You walked to school through snow, through rain, through bright autumn leaves drifting in piles along the sidewalk. Parents didn't fret about the walk. They trusted the neighborhood, trusted the older kids to look out for the younger ones, trusted the teachers who waited at the door. Inside classrooms, lessons were straightforward. Desks arranged in neat rows, chalk dust drifting through sunbeams, textbooks filled with maps, multiplication tables, and stories meant to teach not just information but discipline. When the bell rang for recess, kids erupted into the yard like a burst of energy. There were no elaborate structures, no padded play spaces. Just open ground, a few swings, maybe a metal slide that burned your legs in summer, and enough space for imagination to do the rest. Across the country, whether in quiet coastal towns, bustling cities, or small prairie communities, the rhythm was similar. Days were structured but rarely rushed. Neighborhoods felt familiar, almost predictable in the best possible way. You saw the same faces at the grocery store, the post office, the barber shop. You greeted people by name, not because you were trying to be polite, but because you genuinely knew them. Everything from morning routines to weekend gatherings reinforced that sense of stability, that faith in the idea that your life, your community, your country was moving in a direction that felt hopeful, grounded, and shared. The texture of Canadian life in the 1960s could also be felt in the small rituals that shaped the rhythm of each week. Shopping, for instance, meant stepping into places that weren't just stores but social hubs woven into the fabric of daily life. There were no sprawling big box centers on the edges of town, no online orders dropped silently on doorsteps. Instead, you pushed open the door of the neighborhood grocer and were greeted by the familiar jingle of a small metal bell. The owner knew your name, knew your habits, maybe even knew your family's preferences better than you did. You'd ask about the price of apples or whether fresh bread had come in that morning, and in exchange you'd hear a quick story about a delivery that ran late or a new shipment arriving the next day. The butcher trimmed your order right in front of you, his apron dusted with flour and bone dust. The baker wrapped warm loaves in paper that crackled softly in your hands. The produce clerk stacked fruits in small pyramids, the air around him smelling of oranges and damp wood. Even in larger department stores like Eaton's or Simpson's, the experience retained a kind of elegance. Families didn't wander through those buildings aimlessly. They made an outing of it. Mothers wore their nicer coats. Fathers slicked back their hair. Children behaved just a little better because the polished counters, soft lighting, and neat displays made the place feel special. Stopping at the lunch counter for a sandwich or a milkshake was a treat that lingered in a child's memory long after the taste disappeared. On Saturday afternoons, downtown areas pulsed with life. Streets bustled with people carrying shopping bags, stopping to chat with someone they hadn't seen in months. Movie theaters lit up their marquees as the sun set, inviting families to step inside for an evening escape. Cafes filled with the warm hum of conversations, the clatter of coffee cups, and the scent of pastries rising from glass display cases. Walking down the main street in any Canadian town felt like walking through the heart of a community that existed not just in space but in shared experience. That closeness extended beyond commerce into the very architecture of towns and cities. Before suburbs stretched endlessly outward, before highways carved through neighborhoods and rearranged entire districts, communities had a clear center. People walked more because everything they needed was within reach. A school a few blocks away. A church or synagogue down the road. A barbershop, a diner, a small park, all stitching together daily life into something manageable and intimate. Even the simple act of walking connected people to their environment. You noticed the crispness of autumn air, the creak of snow beneath your boots in January, the scent of lilacs in late spring. You knew which houses had dogs that barked and which had gardens tended with the kind of care that made you slow down and admire the rows of flowers planted in perfect symmetry. Transporting yourself through the city by foot or by streetcar made you a participant in its life, not merely a passerby looking through windows. Even when car ownership grew more common in the latter half of the decade, automobiles felt like an addition to life, not the center of it. Families shared one vehicle, and its use often required negotiation and planning. A teenager might ask to borrow it for a date, a father might need it for work, and a mother might save her errands for a day when the car was available. Owning a car didn't detach people from their surroundings, it simply expanded their possibilities. Weekend drives became small adventures. Piling into the car with the windows rolled down, listening to radio stations that faded in and out as you traveled beyond city limits, stopping for ice cream at roadside stands, these were memories that stitched families together. Cars also helped knit provinces into something more tangible. Highways connected regions in ways that railways once dominated. Visiting relatives in other provinces became not just possible but enjoyable. Families drove through landscapes that shifted from forests to prairies to mountains, each new horizon reminding them of the vastness of the country they called home. In an era before smartphones and portable screens, children watched the world through the window, pointing out barns, rivers, and herds of cattle as they passed. Long drives sparked conversations that bounced between silly and serious, the kind of meandering talks families rarely make time for today. Even as new conveniences appeared, trust remained at the heart of Canadian life. People left their doors unlocked not because crime didn't exist, but because their neighborhoods felt familiar and safe. Strangers were rare, and even rarer was the feeling of threat. Kids left bicycles on the lawn without a second thought. Neighbors collected each other's mail without being asked. If a paperboy made a mistake, it was solved with a friendly chat, not suspicion. The milkman perfectly embodied that trust. Before dawn, his quiet truck rolled down the street. The soft clink of glass bottles carried through the cool morning air. Families left notes under their empty bottles, requests for extra cream or eggs along with a few coins. The milkman took what he needed, left change, and trusted the world to leave his deliveries untouched. No locks, no cameras, just mutual honesty. That trust shaped childhood in ways hard to imagine today. Kids roamed freely, moving through the neighborhood like unofficial members of every household. They knew which porches offered shade, which yards had climbable trees, and which homes had friendly pets. Adults kept a gentle eye on all the children. If someone scraped a knee or wandered too far, a neighbor stepped in to help, not to judge. Every child, in a sense, belonged to the entire community. School mirrored that balance of structure and freedom. Days started with a soft bell, leading students into buildings scented with chalk and floor polish. Teachers earned respect effortlessly. Lessons were simple, distractions few. Recess was an explosion of energy: tag, marbles, skipping rope, soccer with a half-flat ball ending instantly when the bell called everyone back. After school, kids spilled into neighborhoods buzzing with life, trading cards, stories, and laughter. And beneath the calm routines, change was beginning. Social movements pushed for fairness, voices long ignored demanded recognition. Canada was awakening. But what people remember most isn't the politics, it's the trust, the safety, the warmth of modest homes, and the feeling that tomorrow held promise. A time defined not by perfection, but by connection and belonging.